Have you ever been asked to give up your place not because you were wrong, but because someone decided you didn't belong there? On a crowded afternoon at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, a man in his 50s, dressed in a sharp navy suit, sat quietly in his paid first-class seat. What the flight attendant didn't know was that he was David Carter, the CEO of the very airline group operating the plane. She asked only him to move, not anyone else, just him. Imagine the silence. Imagine the stares. Would you stay seated, risking embarrassment, or stand up and surrender what you had rightfully earned? David didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply reached for his phone, and with one quiet call, the entire airline froze. If it had been you in that seat, what would you have done? Would you have had the courage to remain, knowing the world was watching? This is more than a story about an airline. It's about dignity, choices, and the quiet power of refusing to move. Stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe, because what happened on Flight 263 is a lesson none of us can afford to forget. The hum of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport carried a rhythm of its own that afternoon. Rolling suitcases clicked against tile. Voices rose and fell like waves. A winter chill slipped through the jet bridge as passengers shuffled forward, boarding Flight 263 to New York. Among them was David Carter, 52 years old, a tall black man dressed in a sharp navy suit, polished shoes, and a quiet confidence. He walked with the steady pace of someone who had traveled 1,000 times before, not rushed, not timid, but measured. His presence turned heads without him saying a word. To most eyes, he was just another business traveler, a man with a briefcase, a boarding pass, and a first-class ticket. What no one knew, not the agents at the gate, not the flight attendants greeting passengers, not even the captain waiting in the cockpit, was that David Carter was the chief executive officer of the very airline they were flying. He rarely flew commercial, but when he did, he preferred to do it quietly, without announcements, without entourages. Today was one of those days. He was heading to New York for a board meeting, one that would decide new policies on training and customer service. He liked seeing things firsthand, blending into the flow of regular passengers. It reminded him of why he had chosen this industry in the first place, to connect people, to make travel not just possible, but dignified. David stepped into the cabin, his boarding pass still warm from his hand. The air carried that familiar mix of recycled oxygen and the faint scent of coffee brewing in the galley. He moved down the narrow aisle toward the front. First class stretched out before him, wide leather seats, soft lighting, the low murmur of early conversations. He found his spot seat, 2A, window side. He set his briefcase down carefully, eased into the seat, and exhaled. Outside the oval window, the last suitcases were being loaded into the belly of the aircraft. A baggage handler in a neon vest wiped his brow, pausing to adjust the strap on his glove. The late afternoon light caught the metal surface of the plane, throwing back a silver reflection. David sat upright, sliding a folder from his case. Inside were notes for the upcoming meeting proposals for new training programs, a potential overhaul of the complaint process, even ideas about passenger dignity that he hoped would be discussed seriously. He smoothed the pages with his hand, but his mind wandered. He had lived this moment before, not the flight itself, but the feeling of being watched, measured, sometimes questioned. The memory of earlier days surfaced, days when he was a young executive trying to hail a cab in Midtown Manhattan, ignored again and again until someone else whiter, less qualified, stepped off the curb and caught a ride instantly. Those memories had shaped him. They had sharpened his patience. They had taught him to recognize the subtle ways bias revealed itself, and though he wore a suit that afternoon and carried the authority of an entire airline on his shoulders, he knew better than most how quickly people judged without knowing who sat before them. Passengers continued to board. A young woman in business attire clicked across the aisle, juggling a laptop bag and a phone pressed to her ear. Behind her, a couple whispered in Spanish, their child tugging at a stuffed bear with worn seams. Across from David, a man with an expensive watch loosened his tie, sighing as he scrolled his phone. The cabin filled slowly, the overhead bins closing with soft thuds. Flight attendants moved briskly, smiles rehearsed, voices polite. Nothing seemed unusual, not yet. David adjusted his seatbelt, the leather cool against his wrist. He let his gaze drift to the folder again, then to the people around him. He found comfort in the ordinary rhythm of boarding, but beneath that calm was always awareness. He carried it everywhere, an invisible weight. For a moment, he closed his eyes. He thought of his father, who used to tell him dignity isn't something someone else gives you. Son, it's something you carry with you, whether they see it or not. The words returned now, as steady as the heartbeat in his chest. At this point, nothing had happened. To most, he was invisible, just another passenger buckling in before takeoff. But the story was about to shift, pulled by forces that seemed small at first, but would grow into something far larger than a single seat. The seatbelt signs chimed overhead. The engines hummed. Low and steady, the air felt thick, charged, as though the cabin itself was waiting for something to unfold. David Carter sat quietly in 2A, unaware that the next few minutes would transform an ordinary flight into a defining moment, not just for him, but for everyone watching. The last few passengers filed into the cabin, stowing their carry-ons, adjusting coats, settling children. The flow slowed until the jet bridge door clicked shut with a finality that always meant no more stragglers, no more second chances. The hum of the engines deepened, steady and low, like the prelude to a long song. David Carter leaned back against the headrest. The leather creaked softly. He folded the folder of documents on his lap, sliding a pen inside, and rested his hands on the armrest. The plane felt almost calm. Almost. From the galley at the front, a flight attendant stepped forward, blonde hair pinned neatly, uniform pressed, a practiced smile on her face. Jessica, her name badge read. She walked down the short aisle between first-class rows, glancing left and right as though searching for someone. Her eyes landed on David. She stopped beside his seat. Her voice carried just loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear, "Sir, would you mind switching seats so this family can sit together up here?" The words hung in the air. David looked up slowly. He followed her gesture. Just behind the curtain, separating coach from first class, stood a family of 4, a father in a gray sweater, a mother clutching backpacks, and 2 children with anxious eyes. The mother shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, her shoulders pulled tight as if bracing for rejection. David's expression remained calm, but his mind sharpened instantly. He had been in first class countless times. He had seen families separated, couples split between rows. He had seen attendants ask politely, evenly, across multiple passengers. But this felt different. Jessica's words had not carried the open tone of a general request. They had landed squarely, firmly, on him. He let a beat of silence pass before replying. His voice was low, steady. "Have you asked the other passengers as well?" Jessica's smile faltered. "No, just you." Her tone was simple, factual, but the simplicity made it worse. It drew a quiet line around him, singling him out in a cabin full of possibilities. The businessman with the expensive watch across the aisle looked up from his phone, eyebrows raised. The woman in business attire 2 rows ahead lifted her gaze from her laptop, sensing tension. Even the couple speaking Spanish fell silent, glancing toward the scene. A heavy stillness crept into the air. the kind that made every word feel magnified. David didn't move. His hands stayed where they were, resting against the armrest. Jessica lingered, the polite smile on her lips now thin, brittle. It would really help them out, she added, voice a shade firmer. David met her eyes, unwavering. I paid for this seat. I'll remain here. There was no sharpness, no rise in his tone, just clarity, like a line drawn on glass. For a moment, nothing happened. Jessica blinked, as though she hadn't expected resistance. Then she nodded stiffly and turned back toward the galley. But the silence she left behind grew heavier, stretching across the cabin. People shifted in their seats, whispering in low voices. The mother of the family held her children close, cheeks flushed, her gaze fixed firmly on the carpet. David sat still. He felt the old tension rise inside him, that mix of weariness and defiance. How many times had he been singled out at hotels, at restaurants, even in boardrooms? Each time, a choice to let it slide, to surrender a little ground, or to hold his place, quietly, firmly. He remembered his mother's words from years ago, when he was a boy in Birmingham. They'll try to make you smaller, David, but you were born full size. Don't ever let them shrink you. His jaw tightened slightly. He breathed in through his nose, slow, deliberate, and exhaled. A minute later, the supervisor arrived, a tall man with a trim beard and a polished uniform jacket. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, the tone of someone used to handling complaints without raising his own. Mr. Carter, he began, dipping his head politely. I understand you'd prefer not to move, but there is a family who would be very grateful if you'd make this small accommodation. I'm sure you understand. David turned his head toward him, his eyes steady. I understand perfectly, he replied. I also understand I purchased this seat, and I intend to remain here. If the family requires seats together, I suggest you speak with the other passengers in this cabin, all of them. The supervisor hesitated, caught off guard by the precision in David's voice. Around them, passengers leaned closer, ears straining. The businessman across the aisle murmured under his breath. Most people would have lost their temper by now. You didn't. Jessica stood near the galley, arms crossed lightly, her face pale. Another attendant, Maria, approached her, her eyes questioning. You okay? Maria asked softly. Jessica forced a smile. I just thought I was helping the family. Maria tilted her head, not unkindly. Helping who exactly? Jessica's smile slipped. She looked down at her shoes, saying nothing. Meanwhile, the supervisor shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his jacket. He opened his mouth again, but David lifted a hand slightly, stopping him. I'm not here to discuss arrangements, David said evenly. I'm here because I have a right to be here. That should be enough. The words were simple, but they carried weight. A current of recognition rippled through the cabin. Passengers glanced at one another. Some frowned, some nodded, but no one spoke loudly. Still, the energy was undeniable. Something was happening that went beyond one seat. In the cockpit, the captain tapped a message into the comms, frowning. From ground control came the instruction, hold position. The engines remained in idle, waiting. The co-pilot drummed his fingers on the yoke, sensing unease. Back in the cabin, a little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. Why are we not moving? She whispered. The mother hushed her gently, but her eyes darted toward the front, then back down again. David sat still, his folder untouched on his lap. The weight of the moment pressed against him. He could feel the judgment, the expectation, the silent hope from some passengers that he would yield, and the equally silent admiration from others that he had not. Inside, his thoughts were less calm than his face. He wondered, briefly, if staying put would make him the villain in this cabin story. Would passengers see him as selfish, unwilling to help, or would they see the truth that he was being asked something no one else had been asked? The tension climbed, thread by thread, binding the air tighter with each passing second. David Carter looked out the window, the tarmac bathed in fading sunlight, and thought, "Not this time. I will not shrink." The engines hummed low, the cabin hushed, the story balanced on a knife's edge. Everyone was waiting for the next move. The silence after David's refusal did not fade. It thickened. It sat heavy on the leather seats and in the narrow aisle. What had started as a single question between one flight attendant and one passenger now floated through the cabin like smoke, impossible to ignore. Passengers shifted. A cough here, the rustle of a magazine there. Conversations that had begun about business deals or weekend plans stilled as eyes flicked toward seat 2A, toward the calm man in the navy suit who refused to move. Jessica lingered near the galley, her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. The supervisor whispered into his radio, his tone clipped, carrying notes of both irritation and worry. His eyes darted back toward David, then toward the cockpit, then away again. Maria, standing beside the beverage cart, scanned the rows. Her instincts told her something larger was at stake. She had served flights for 10 years. She had seen disputes over seats, over luggage space, over armrests. But this was different. It wasn't what was asked. It was how it was asked, and to whom. Across the aisle, the businessman with the expensive watch leaned forward, elbows on his knees, studying David. "You handled that with more grace than most would," he said softly. David turned his head slightly, his expression measured. He gave a single nod. No words. 2 rows up, the woman in business attire closed her laptop. She had been immersed in spreadsheets a moment earlier, but now she couldn't concentrate. She looked over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing, trying to piece together what she had just witnessed. In coach, whispers began to ripple as the family stood uncertainly by the curtain. The father shifted from foot to foot, his jaw tight. The mother clutched the children's backpacks as though they were shields. She seemed almost ashamed, unwilling to raise her eyes to anyone. Passengers nearby started murmuring, "Why only him?" One voice said in a low tone. "Strange, isn't it?" another replied. The question hovered unspoken. Was this about courtesy or about something else? David sat still, his breathing even. Inside. However, his thoughts wrestled with one another. Part of him longed to let it go, to avoid drawing more attention, but another part, deeper and older, refused. He remembered the countless small slights over decades, the times when his seat at the table was questioned, when his presence in a boardroom was treated as an anomaly, when he had been told, directly or indirectly, that he should be grateful simply to be there. He thought of Rosa Parks, of the history written into quiet refusals. He thought of his father telling him, "Sometimes you sit, and that is enough." The supervisor returned to his side. His smile was strained now, his voice lower but edged with insistence. "Mr. Carter, if you'll just help us resolve this quickly, we can be on our way. It's a small thing. The family would appreciate it." David's eyes did not waver. "I told you already. I purchased this seat. I intend to remain here." The supervisor's jaw flexed. He glanced around the cabin, aware of the watching eyes. Authority slipped through his fingers, and he knew it. Still, he tried once more. "It's just, well, sometimes flexibility makes everything easier," he said. David cut in, his words sharp in their precision. "And sometimes yielding when you should not makes everything harder for everyone who comes after you." The line cracked like a whip. The supervisor fell silent. Jessica turned her face away, color draining from her cheeks. Maria watched her quietly, then moved to the other side of the cabin, attending to passengers with a professionalism Jessica no longer carried. A whisper ran down the rows like an electric current. People shifted, exchanging looks. The discomfort was contagious. In the cockpit, the captain received another update from ground control hold position. He frowned, pulled the manifest closer, and traced his finger down the list of names. When his eyes landed on Carter, David, recognition flickered. He leaned back, his stomach tightening. He knew that name. Back in the cabin, tension pressed in from all sides. A little girl in row 4 tugged at her father's sleeve. "Why aren't we going yet?" she asked. The father glanced at David, then back at his daughter. "Because sometimes," he whispered, "we wait for someone to do the right thing." David heard it faintly, a murmur carried by the air. His chest tightened. He wondered again, would the passengers see him as the obstacle, or as the man holding the line? He closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. His heart thudded a little faster, but his face betrayed none of it. Years of boardrooms, of negotiations, of being underestimated had taught him the value of silence. Let others reveal themselves first. The businessman with the watch leaned across the aisle once more. "You remind me of someone," he said. "My grandfather." He never raised his voice, either, but he made sure no one pushed him out of his place. David allowed a faint smile to flicker at the corner of his lips. "Your grandfather was a wise man," he said. The man nodded, his eyes softening. Jessica shifted in the galley, fidgeting with the corners of her uniform. Maria approached her again, quietly. "Jessica," she said gently, "you need to think about what just happened, about why you asked only him." Jessica's throat worked as she swallowed. "I was trying to help." "Were you?" Maria asked, her voice calm but pointed. "Or were you assuming he was the one who should give something up?" Jessica's eyes dropped to the floor. She had no answer. Meanwhile, the cabin buzzed with restrained energy. Passengers whispered, eyes flicking toward David, toward Jessica, toward the supervisor still hovering near the galley. The story was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone on that plane. David Carter sat in seat 2A, unmoving. His folder lay untouched, the words inside irrelevant now. He was aware of every glance, every breath, every ripple of tension. He felt the weight of history pressing on his shoulders, the knowledge that sometimes refusing to move wasn't about stubbornness. It was about survival. It was about dignity. It was about all the unseen battles fought by those who came before him, who had been told in 100 ways, subtle and loud, that their place was negotiable. Not this time. The engines hummed, the air thickened, the moment stretched taut. Somewhere beyond the fuselage, the sun dipped lower over Atlanta, painting the tarmac in streaks of fading gold. Inside, the passengers waited, caught in a story they hadn't asked to join, but one they would never forget. David breathed once more, slow and steady. He sat still. He stayed. The cabin waited with him. The cabin of Flight 263 had fallen into an uneasy rhythm. Passengers whispered, eyes shifting from David Carter to the flight attendants, from the still family by the curtain to the supervisor pacing near the galley. The engines hummed, waiting. Yet the plane itself did not move. The pause stretched longer than usual, heavy, with unspoken tension. David remained in seat 2A, his posture calm, though every nerve in his body felt the pressure. Years of navigating rooms where he was doubted, questioned, or dismissed had prepared him for this moment. But still, the sting of being singled out pierced deeper than he wanted to admit. He looked at Jessica, who lingered near the beverage cart, her hands fiddling with a napkin she didn't need. She refused to meet his gaze. The supervisor's radio crackled faintly at his side, words muffled but sharp. Passengers shifted, waiting for something, anything to break the stalemate. David inhaled slowly, letting the air fill his chest. He thought about his father again, about Birmingham, about long summers when he learned that dignity was a shield you could carry silently, but never surrender. He thought about every young man or woman who might one day sit in this same seat and face the same subtle humiliation. He reached for his phone. The motion was unhurried, deliberate. He slid it from his pocket, the black case catching the overhead light. He pressed one number, waited a single beat, then lifted the phone to his ear. When the call connected, he spoke just 4 words, his voice even, calm, carrying no more weight than if he were ordering coffee. "This is Carter. Activate." That was all. He lowered the phone and set it gently on the armrest. To the passengers around him, it looked like nothing. A simple call, no raised voice, no demand. But the effect began almost instantly. Jessica froze, her pale face draining further. The supervisor stiffened, his hand tightening on his radio. Maria's eyes widened slightly, though she said nothing, continuing to pour water into a passenger's glass with steady hands. The businessman with the watch leaned closer, his voice low. "What did you just do?" David didn't answer. His expression remained serene, but inside he felt the shift like a current moving under the surface. Moments later, 2 figures in dark suits appeared at the jet bridge, their stride purposeful. They boarded the aircraft with quiet authority, their shoes clicking softly against the floor. They moved past the curtain, past the curious eyes of coach passengers, into the first-class cabin, every head turned. The taller of the 2, a man with close-cropped hair and sharp eyes, approached David first. He inclined his head with respect. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice carrying just enough for the nearby rows to hear. "We received your call. We're here to ensure your flight proceeds as planned." David gave a single nod. He did not smile, did not gloat. The second man, broader in build, turned toward Jessica and the supervisor. His tone was professional, clipped, undeniable. "May we speak with you both outside?" Please, Jessica's lips parted as though to protest, but no words came. Her throat worked as she swallowed. The supervisor's face flushed crimson, sweat shining at his temple. Slowly, stiffly, they followed the suited men down the aisle, past the rows of eyes watching them leave. The curtain closed behind them. Inside the cabin, the energy shifted. The hum of tension loosened. Passengers exchanged glances, some whispering, others sitting back in silence. The woman in business attire let out a long breath, her laptop forgotten on the tray table. The businessman with the watch leaned back, murmuring. Well, that explains it. Maria, now clearly in charge, approached David with a glass of water. Her smile was genuine, quiet but steady. "Thank you for your patience, sir," she said softly. David accepted the glass, nodding, and "Thank you for your respect." Their exchange was brief, but it carried weight. Around them, passengers sensed the change. A wrong had been named, corrected not with shouting, but with silence, with calm authority. At the rear of first class, the father of the waiting family pressed a hand to his wife's shoulder. She still avoided eye contact, her cheeks pink with shame. The children clutched their backpacks tighter, sensing more than they could understand. The businessman with the watch spoke again, his tone reverent. "I have been on flights where people screamed over less. You didn't raise your voice once. You didn't have to." David's gaze turned toward the window. Outside, the tarmac glowed in late sunlight. He thought about the paradox of power, that sometimes its greatest expression came not in force, but in restraint. The engines rumbled deeper, preparing for taxi. The intercom crackled as the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. Thank you for your patience. We'll be taking off shortly." His tone was steady, professional, but underneath it was a new layer: respect, perhaps even deference. David lifted the glass to his lips, the water cool against his throat. His heartbeat slowed. The moment was not over, but it had shifted. He had shifted it. Passengers in nearby rows leaned closer, whispering their support. An older woman across the aisle touched his arm lightly. "Thank you for standing your ground," she whispered. David met her eyes, gave a small nod. That's all anyone should ever have to do. As the plane began its slow roll toward the runway, David felt the cabin settle. The chatter softened. The children relaxed. The tension dispersed into something gentler. Yet beneath the calm, he knew the echoes of this moment would travel further than the walls of this plane. He thought again of his father's words. Dignity isn't given, it's carried. David Carter had carried it into this cabin, and he would not set it down. When Jessica and the supervisor stepped out of the cabin with the two men in suits, the entire first class seemed to exhale at once. The heavy silence that had smothered the rouse began to loosen. But the unease had not left. It hovered still, like turbulence you couldn't see but could feel in your bones. David Carter stayed in seat 2A, hands resting on the folder in his lap. He hadn't touched the document since the moment Jessica asked him to move. He wasn't thinking about policies or training now. He was thinking about something larger, about what it meant to sit still when every part of the system expected you to give way. Maria moved quietly through the aisle, her posture professional, but her eyes soft. She stopped by David once again. "We'll take care of everything," she said gently. "Please, make yourself comfortable." "Thank you," David replied. His tone was calm, but the weight in his voice made Maria's chest tighten. She nodded and returned to her duties, her steps measured. From the corner of his eye, David noticed the businessman with the expensive watch watching him again. The man leaned closer. "I've been on dozens of flights," he said. "Never seen anything like this." "You didn't raise your voice once. That takes strength." David gave a small nod. "Strength," he said, "isn't always in the noise." The man sat back, thoughtful, as though the words had struck deeper than he expected. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, the curtain rippled. Jessica's pale face appeared briefly as she was guided back through by one of the suited men. Her eyes darted nervously across the rows before she disappeared again. This time, through the door at the front of the aircraft. The supervisor followed, head lowered, shoulders hunched. Neither looked back. Passengers shifted, whispering. The woman in business attire whispered to the man across from her. "Did you see that they're gone?" The businessman replied. "Good. About time. In the cockpit." The captain placed his headset down for a moment, exhaling slowly. He had recognized David's name earlier on the manifest, but he hadn't expected this. He exchanged a look with the co-pilot, who drummed his fingers nervously on the throttle. "We wait," the captain said quietly. "Orders will come soon." Back in the cabin, Maria continued her rounds, offering water, tucking stray blankets, checking seatbelts. Her voice was steady, but her thoughts replayed the scene over and over. Jessica's insistence, David's calm refusal, the way the air had thickened with something much older than a seating dispute. She paused at row 3, bending down to check on the older woman who had earlier whispered her thanks to David. The woman patted Maria's hand. "That man," she said, nodding toward seat 2A. He's teaching all of us something. Maria smiled faintly. Yes, ma'am, she replied. He is. The hum of the engines deepened. The plane was still on hold, but ground crew prepared outside, waiting for clearance. Baggage handlers stood by, glancing toward the aircraft with curiosity. Even they could sense something unusual was happening inside. The father in the waiting family finally leaned toward his wife. "We should have said something," he murmured. His wife shook her head, eyes down. "What could we have said?" Her voice trembled. She squeezed the children's backpacks tighter, guilt pressing heavy on her shoulders. David noticed them. He didn't hold them responsible. He could see their discomfort, the shame in the mother's lowered eyes. He knew too well what it felt like to be placed unwillingly at the center of someone else's miscalculation. The intercom crackled, startling everyone slightly. The captain's voice filled the cabin once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We'll be departing shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." His words were even, but David caught the subtle shift beneath them. Respect. Recognition. Moments later, the suited men returned, this time without Jessica or the supervisor. They moved with quiet assurance, nodding toward Maria, who acknowledged them with a brief tilt of her head. One of the men stopped by David's seat again. "Mr. Carter," he said, "everything is in order now. The crew has been adjusted. You'll have no further issues on this flight." David inclined his head. "Thank you." The man's eyes lingered on him for a second longer, carrying an unspoken message. "We know who you are, and we will not forget this." With that, the men left the cabin, exiting through the jet bridge. The door sealed behind them with a solid thud. The shift was immediate. Maria now clearly took the lead, her voice warm as she greeted passengers, her smile genuine as she reassured those who looked unsettled. The entire atmosphere changed, like a storm cloud moving on and sunlight filtering through. David sat back, gazing out the window. The late sun bathed the wing in gold. For the first time since boarding, he felt the tension in his chest ease. Still, the echoes of what had happened lingered. He could hear passengers murmuring, "That was unbelievable." He just sat there, never raised his voice. The businessman with the watch spoke once more, almost to himself. "They'll talk about this long after we land." An older passenger nodded in agreement. They always remember when someone stands up by sitting down. David's lips curved into the faintest smile. He lifted the glass of water Maria had given him earlier and took a slow sip. His mind drifted, not to anger, not to triumph, but to the quiet recognition that sometimes the strongest act was the simplest staying put. Outside, the engines roared, ready for takeoff. Inside, the cabin settled into calm. Passengers buckled in, attendants prepared for departure. Children whispered quietly to their parents. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt different than before. It felt like respect. David Carter glanced once more at the fading light outside. He carried no pride, only resolve. This was never about winning. It was about not surrendering what was already his. As the plane pushed back from the gate, the hum of movement rising beneath the floor, David closed his eyes briefly. For the first time since stepping onto Flight 263, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The journey was just beginning. The plane rolled slowly away from the gate. The movement itself felt symbolic, like the cabin was finally able to breathe after being held in suspension, yet no one had forgotten what they had just witnessed. The air carried a charge, still quiet, unspoken, but undeniably present. David Carter leaned slightly against the window, watching the ground crew fade into the distance as the aircraft lined up with the taxiway. His reflection stared back at him in the glass-steady eyes, composed face, the navy suit framing a man who had refused to bend. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Maria walked the aisle with calm precision, making last checks before takeoff. She stopped at David's row once more. Everything all right here? Sir David turned his head toward her. Her tone was different than Jessica's earlier. Not rehearsed, not forced. Real, yes, he replied. Thank you, Maria. The way he spoke her name made her pause. She nodded, a hint of warmth in her smile, and moved on. Across the aisle, the businessman with the watch leaned back, folding his hands. He had been watching the entire time, and now his voice carried the low timbre of reflection. You didn't just stay in your seat, he murmured. You shifted the whole plane. David met his gaze briefly. Sometimes the smallest choices echo the loudest. The man nodded slowly, as if filing those words away. A murmur rose from behind. The woman in business attire whispered to her seatmate, I've never seen anything like it. He didn't even raise his voice. Her seatmate replied, That's why it worked. Row by row, passengers seemed to be quietly recalibrating their sense of what had just occurred. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady but with an undertone of sincerity. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, we thank you for your patience. Flight attendants, please prepare for takeoff. The engines roared louder, the runway stretched ahead, and the plane surged forward. For a moment, every head pressed back into their seats as gravity pulled against them. Then, with a smooth lift, the aircraft rose above Atlanta, climbing into the orange glow of the late afternoon sky. David glanced down at the patchwork of roads and highways shrinking beneath the clouds. He felt the shift in his chest, too, not just altitude, but the change in atmosphere within the cabin. The tension had not vanished completely, but it had been reshaped. It had turned into something quieter, more respectful, as if passengers had collectively realized they had been present for something larger than themselves. Maria moved down the aisle after takeoff, offering drinks. She paused at the row where an older woman sat, the same woman who had touched David's arm earlier. The woman accepted a cup of tea, then leaned closer to Maria. That man, she whispered, nodding toward 2A. He carries himself like someone who's had to fight for every inch, but he makes it look effortless. Maria smiled softly. Yes, he does. At row 4, the father who had hushed his daughter earlier leaned close to her again. You remember what you asked me, he said. The little girl tilted her head. Why we weren't moving. Yes. Well, sometimes people stop things because something important is happening. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay put. The girl blinked, then nodded, her small hand clutching her father's armrest. David overheard the exchange faintly. It stirred something deep inside him, an ache. Yes, but also a flicker of pride. He hadn't spoken for anyone but himself, yet his choice had carried further than he imagined. The family of 4 still sat uneasily at the back of first class, their children pressed against them. The mother's eyes darted toward David occasionally, filled with a mix of apology and discomfort. The father remained stiff, jaw set. David noticed, but he didn't harbor resentment. He knew they too had been caught in a current not of their making. Maria approached them gently, crouching down to speak with the children, offering them coloring books and crayons she kept tucked in the galley. The children's faces lit up for the first time since boarding. Their laughter, soft but real, eased the edges of the cabin's lingering weight. Meanwhile, David closed his eyes briefly, resting his head against the seat. His thoughts swirled. He thought about the years it had taken him to reach this position, the late nights, the sacrifices, the countless times he had been the only black man in a room full of decision-makers. He thought about the subtle dismissals, the times his ideas were ignored until someone else repeated them. And he thought about this flight, how a simple refusal to move had turned into something so much bigger. The businessman with the watch shifted again, unable to keep quiet. "I have to say," he said quietly to David, "I'll be thinking about this for a long time. You reminded me that respect isn't optional." David turned his gaze from the window, his eyes meeting the man's. "It never has been," he said. The man looked away, his expression sobered, as though he had realized something he should have known all along. The woman in business attire tapped at her phone. David could see the faint glow of a social media app. She wasn't posting yet, but she was drafting. He knew the story was already escaping the walls of the aircraft, carried by whispers, by glances, by the quiet churn of online voices. Maria returned to David's side once more, offering him a refill of water. He accepted, thanking her softly. She hesitated, then said, "Mr. Carter, I want you to know, not everyone would have handled it the way you did. It matters." David studied her face. She wasn't flattering him. She was speaking from conviction. He inclined his head. "It matters to me, too," he said. For a while, the cabin settled into an ordinary flight. Drinks clinked. Pages of magazines turned. Children colored pictures of airplanes. But the ordinariness itself felt new, like a gift, after the storm that had passed. David leaned back, closing his eyes again. For the first time since boarding, the hum of the engine sounded peaceful, not tense. The sunlight through the window painted his face gold. He thought, not with pride, but with quiet certainty, respect restored is not the same as respect never taken, but it is still worth holding on to. And so he held it, seat 2A steady beneath him as the plane climbed higher into the fading light. At 30,000 feet, the cabin had finally settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Drinks were served, trays tucked neatly away, and passengers leaned back into their seats as if the drama from the gate belonged to another world. Yet everyone knew the ripples of what had happened hadn't stopped at the runway. David Carter sat motionless in 2A, his hands folded loosely over the folder he still hadn't opened. His phone rested on the armrest, its black screen blank now, but its weight undeniable. One short call had shifted the course of the entire flight, and maybe something more. Maria walked down the aisle again, stopping at row 4 where the father had whispered lessons to his daughter earlier. She bent low, asking softly if they needed anything. The girl held up a coloring page of an airplane she had filled with purple and green. Maria smiled, placing a small sticker in the corner before continuing on. But at the back of the plane, the curtain separating first class from the galley rustled. The two corporate security men who had escorted Jessica and the supervisor out earlier returned briefly. They didn't address the passengers, only whispered a few words to Maria before exiting again. Their presence was like a reminder this wasn't over. David noticed. He always noticed. His eyes tracked their movements, then shifted back to the window. He thought of the boardroom where he had spent the last week negotiating a contract that would decide the airline's future. Numbers, projections, billions of dollars at stake. And yet here he was, forced to remind his own employees that respect wasn't negotiable. The businessman with the watch leaned closer again. "You realize this is going to be everywhere, right? People are already talking." David's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not why I stayed in my seat." The man held up a hand. "I know, but the world will see it that way." David didn't reply. He didn't need to. In the cockpit, The captain exchanged glances with his co-pilot. The manifest still sat open, David's name circled in pen. The captain cleared his throat, toggling the intercom again. Ladies and gentlemen, as we continue our climb, we'd like to remind you this is a smooth flight today. We expect to arrive on time. Please sit back and relax. His tone carried more than reassurance. It carried recognition that the delay and its cause had been more than routine. Back on the ground, the dominoes had already begun to fall. In a small office near the terminal, Jessica sat stiffly in a chair, her uniform still pressed, but her hands shaking slightly in her lap. The supervisor sat across from her, his jaw clenched, sweat still glistening at his temple. The HR manager, a woman with sharp eyes and clipped speech, paced slowly in front of them. "Do you understand?" she said, her tone cold. "What your actions today have triggered?" Jessica tried to speak. The HR manager cut her off. "You singled out one passenger. Only one. Do you realize who he is?" Jessica's mouth opened, closed. Her voice came out thin. "I didn't know." "That," the HR manager replied, "is not an excuse." The supervisor shifted, his voice defensive. "We were trying to accommodate a family by ignoring policy, by ignoring every other seat in the cabin, by creating an incident that halted boarding for 20 minutes. Neither answered. The HR manager's tone hardened further. "You are both on immediate leave. Your badges, please." Jessica's hands trembled as she unclipped her name tag, the small piece of plastic suddenly unbearably heavy. The supervisor followed suit, his jaw locked tight. Corporate security stood at the door, silent, waiting to escort them out. Jessica stared down at the badge in her palm before placing it on the desk. She felt a hollowness in her chest, the weight of a career she had once believed secure dissolving in a single moment. Meanwhile, up in the air, David felt none of this directly, but he sensed it. He had been in enough rooms, enough negotiations, to know the machinery was already moving. Maria approached his row again, lowering her voice. "Mr. Carter," she said carefully, "I just wanted you to know steps are being taken immediately." David studied her, his face unreadable. Then he nodded once. "Thank you." Her eyes softened. She lingered a second longer, then moved on. The businessman with the watch tapped at his phone, scrolling. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "It's already online," he murmured. David turned his head slightly, but didn't ask. He didn't need to know. He understood how quickly stories traveled in a world where every passenger carried a camera in their pocket. The woman in business attire finally lifted her phone, pressing post. A caption glowed briefly on the screen. He never shouted, he never moved, and somehow he shifted the ground under all of us. Within minutes, likes and shares would spread beyond the fuselage into terminals, living rooms, and boardrooms across the country. But in 2A, David remained still. He looked out at the sky stretching endlessly beyond the glass. His mind returned to his father's words, the mantra he had carried for decades. Dignity isn't granted, it's carried. And tonight, he thought, it had been tested again. The engines droned steady, the clouds parted, and the plane cut through open sky. Yet the real journey had already begun, unfolding not in miles, but in meaning. David allowed himself a quiet exhale. Not relief, never relief, but steadiness. For the rest of the flight, he stayed silent. He didn't open the folder on his lap, didn't return a single email. He just sat, carrying the weight of the moment like armor. Passengers glanced his way now and then, offering subtle nods, quiet acknowledgments, respect restored, if only in fragments. And though he said nothing, David knew this was only the beginning. By the time Flight 263 pierced through the thin clouds above the eastern seaboard, the story had already leapt far beyond the cabin walls. Passengers with phones had whispered, typed, and posted. Clips were circulating, hashtags forming, commentary sparking like brush fire. David Carter remained silent in 2A, but his full name, was already trending in boardrooms he had never stepped into and living rooms he would never visit. Back on the ground, in a sleek glass tower rising above downtown Atlanta, the airline's headquarters buzzed with sudden urgency. What had begun as a routine Thursday had turned into a crisis hour. In the 21st floor conference room, the CEO of the airline group, Richard Hall, leaned forward in his chair, his silver hair catching the fluorescent light. Around him, executives shuffled papers they hadn't read, stared at phones glowing with real-time updates, or whispered to assistants rushing in and out with fragments of information. Richard's voice was sharp. "Tell me exactly what happened." A communications director, pale and sweating, cleared her throat. "Sir, a passenger, David Carter, was asked to give up his first-class seat. He refused. The incident escalated. Security intervened. Flight attendants were removed. The flight was delayed 20 minutes. Richard's hand froze midair. "David Carter." The room went silent. "Do you mean," he said slowly, "the David Carter?" The director nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Yes, the CEO of Carter Global Holdings, our largest private investor." Murmurs rippled around the table. Someone swore under their breath. Someone else whispered, "He owns nearly 10% of the company." Richard closed his eyes briefly, the weight of it settling like stone. So our own CEO shareholder was singled out on his own airline. No one answered. They didn't have to. Richard opened his eyes, sharp again. "Where are the employees involved?" The HR chief spoke quickly. "The flight attendant, Jessica, and the supervisor have been placed on immediate leave. Their badges pulled. An investigation is underway." Investigation. Richard's voice cut through the room. "We don't need an investigation to know what happened. We need accountability." He pushed back from the table, rising to his feet. "Draft me a statement. Clear. Direct. Apology first. No corporate spin. We own this mistake." The communications director nodded, scribbling furiously. Richard turned to the HR chief again. "And training. I want proposals on my desk by morning for comprehensive anti-bias retraining. Every employee. From gate agents to pilots. No exceptions." A murmur of assent circled the table, though unease lingered. Richard leaned forward, his palms pressing flat against the polished wood. "We will not be the airline that treats our own investors or any passenger like they don't belong in the seat they paid for." The room fell silent, executives avoiding his gaze. They all knew this was no longer just a personnel issue. This was about survival of reputation, of trust, of the very brand itself. Meanwhile, aboard Flight 263, David remained composed. Maria checked in on him once more, offering another drink. He declined with a polite shake of the head. "I'll be fine," he said. Maria hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Sir, I just want you to know, the company is moving quickly. People are listening." David studied her expression. She was young, perhaps mid-30s, but her eyes carried the weariness of someone who had already seen too many incidents brushed aside. He gave her a quiet nod. "Then let's hope they keep listening," he replied. "At the back of first class," whispers continued. The businessman with the watch refreshed his phone, raising his eyebrows again. "It's official," he murmured to his neighbor. "There's already a statement being drafted. People are demanding answers." The older woman leaned closer, her voice tinged with awe. "Imagine." All he did was stay in his seat. Her neighbor replied, "Sometimes that's all it takes." High above the ground, David closed his eyes. He didn't think of headlines or stock prices. He thought of his father, walking through Birmingham streets, holding his hand, teaching him that dignity was not optional. He thought of the children on this plane, their wide eyes taking in everything, and he thought of tomorrow, of what choices would ripple beyond today's insult. Back at headquarters, Richard Hall stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the skyline. His reflection stared back at him, a man who had spent decades steering a company through turbulence, but never like this. He spoke without turning. When he lands, I want a direct call arranged. No intermediaries, no excuses. Yes, sir, an aide said quickly. Richard finally turned, his expression steel. And prepare the board. They'll want answers too. If we fail this test, we fail all of them. The executives nodded, tension thick in the room. They all knew the airline's survival wasn't about the engines or the schedules tonight. It was about respect. Back in the sky, David adjusted his tie slightly, then leaned back, gazing at the soft glow of sunset cresting over the horizon. The plane hummed steady, but beneath it he felt the tremor of something larger. The reckoning had begun. By the time Flight 263 touched down at LaGuardia, the world outside had already shifted. Passengers reached for their phones the instant the wheels hit the tarmac, and the quiet cabin transformed into a flurry of notifications, buzzing screens, and whispers exchanged over glowing feeds. David Carter gathered his folder, sliding it into his briefcase with the same deliberate calm he had carried all day. Around him, passengers didn't surge to the aisle as usual. They stayed seated, almost in silent respect, as though the ritual of rushing off the plane could wait a moment longer. Maria stood at the front, her hands folded neatly, her smile subdued but genuine. As David approached, she lowered her voice. "Thank you again, sir. Not just for your patience, but for reminding us what dignity looks like." David met her eyes. All anyone should ask for is respect. Nothing more, nothing less. She nodded, as if those words settled something in her. Outside the gate, corporate staff waited nervously. They didn't surround him, didn't push. They simply fell in step, escorting him quietly through the terminal. Cameras from bystanders caught glimpses, photos that would later flood news feeds with captions like "The Man Who Didn't Move." That night, in a hotel suite overlooking the city skyline. David sat at his desk with the curtains half drawn. The glow of Manhattan spilled across the glass, lights flickering like restless stars. His phone buzzed relentlessly. Calls from colleagues, messages from journalists, even old acquaintances reaching out after years of silence. He ignored most of them. Instead, he opened his laptop, scrolling through early coverage. Headlines screamed across the screen: Black CEO refuses to move. Sparks airline reckoning. Flight 263. A lesson in dignity at 30,000 feet. He never raised his voice. He changed everything. David leaned back, his hand rubbing at his temple. He had lived long enough to know how stories bent and twisted in the public square. What he hadn't expected was how many people saw themselves in his refusal to move. He clicked open one video clip, a shaky recording from a passenger in row 3. The caption read, "He didn't shout. He just stayed in his seat." The video showed him, quiet and composed, while Jessica hovered awkwardly by the galley. The audio caught the murmur of passengers, the heavy silence, the voice of the businessman with the watch offering respect. The comments poured beneath. "I've been there. Different situation, same feeling of being singled out. This man gave me hope tonight. Respect isn't optional." David closed the laptop gently. His chest tightened, not from anger this time, but from something deeper, heavier: responsibility. A soft knock at the door broke his thoughts. It was his longtime assistant, Marcia, carrying a stack of printed updates. Her expression was tired, but her presence steady. "They're calling this a turning point," she said, setting the papers down. "The company is drafting a new policy framework. HR already announced Jessica and the supervisor's termination." David exhaled slowly. "That won't be enough." Marcia tilted her head. "What do you mean?" He rose from his chair, walking toward the window. The city stretched endlessly below, a reminder of how small one man could feel against the weight of it all. "They'll think firing 2 people fixes the problem," David said. "But it doesn't. This wasn't just about them. It's about the culture that made them think it was acceptable." Marcia watched him, waiting. He turned back, his eyes sharper now. "I'm not just going to let this pass. Not this time." For a long moment, silence hung between them. Then she nodded. "I'll set up the calls." When she left, David remained by the glass. His reflection stared back, a man who hadn't chosen this fight but couldn't walk away from it. Memories stirred his father's firm grip on his shoulder, telling him as a boy that sometimes the world would try to shrink him, but he must never let it. He thought of the look in the little girl's eyes on the plane when her father told her that courage sometimes meant staying put. David closed his eyes, letting the weight of those moments settle. Meanwhile, outside in the city, the story spread further. On late-night television, commentators debated the meaning of Flight 263. Civil rights leaders called it a reminder of how far there was still to go. Airline analysts warned of market backlash. Everyday people posted their own experiences of subtle humiliations in workplaces, schools, and airports. A hashtag trended worldwide. "Stay seated." The businessman with the watch even posted a short video from his hotel room. "I was there. I watched a man change the air in a cabin by refusing to give up his seat." We should all think about what that means. David's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from his daughter, Camille, a law student in Boston. "Dad, I'm proud of you. People need to see what you showed today." He stared at the message for a long time, his heart tightening in a way that no boardroom or headline could touch. He typed back simply, "Thank you, Camille. Carry it with you." As the night deepened, David finally allowed himself to sit. He opened a notebook, its pages half filled with scribbles from previous trips, and began to write. Not for the media, not for the board, but for himself. He wrote about the silence in the cabin, about the moment dignity became heavier than gravity, about how respect, once denied, had to be reclaimed not with shouting, but with stillness. His handwriting slowed as fatigue pressed against him, but he kept writing because he knew tomorrow would demand speeches, meetings, negotiations, but tonight was for remembering. Far across the city, Jessica sat in her small apartment, staring at the termination letter from HR. The supervisor cleared his desk alone, his career dissolving into quiet regret. Neither could escape the weight of what had happened. But David wasn't thinking of them anymore. He was thinking of what came next. For the first time since boarding Flight 263, he allowed himself a small, weary smile. Not of triumph, but of possibility. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever wondered if they belonged. And tonight, maybe, they had their answer. Morning light spilled across the skyline of New York City in a boardroom high above the streets. Walls of glass reflected the sun's first glow as executives shuffled uneasily into leather chairs. At the head of the table sat Richard Hall, the airline group's CEO, his expression set like stone. On the screen at the far end of the room, David Carter's face appeared calm, unreadable, framed by the quiet elegance of his office. The silence that followed his image carried weight heavier than any opening speech. Richard broke it first. "Mr. Carter, thank you for agreeing to this call. Before anything else, I want to extend my personal apology. What happened on Flight 263 was unacceptable." David's voice was measured. "Apology accepted, but let me be clear, this is not about me. It's about every passenger who has ever felt singled out, diminished, or invisible in your cabins." The room shifted. Executives avoided his gaze, shuffling papers that didn't matter. David continued, "You cannot solve this by terminating 2 employees and issuing a press release. That's the easy way out. What matters is what you build after this. Systems, training, accountability. Those are what decide if this incident becomes a turning point or just another headline." Richard nodded slowly. "We understand. We're prepared to implement comprehensive reforms, anti-bias training, third-party audits, anonymous reporting mechanisms, whatever it takes." David leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "Not whatever it takes. Exactly what it takes. Words will not rebuild trust. Actions will." His tone wasn't raised, but it cut through the room like glass. Richard cleared his throat. "We'll launch a task force immediately." "I'd like your guidance," David interrupted, softly but firmly. "I don't need a seat on your task force. I need to see measurable change. Passenger complaints down. Employee training hours logged. Promotions that reflect the diversity of the people who fly with you. Show me the data. Show the world the data." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Richard said quietly, "You have my word." David let the silence linger before replying, "Good. Because respect is not optional. Not in the sky. Not anywhere." The call ended, but its impact lingered. Outside, reporters crowded the sidewalks. Headlines shifted from outrage to accountability. Airline CEO promises sweeping reform. After Carter incident, commentators debated not just what had happened, but what it revealed about society at large. Meanwhile, in communities far beyond New York, the story of Flight 263 became a touchstone. At schools, teachers used it to spark conversations about dignity and courage. At workplaces, employees swapped stories of the small humiliations they had endured. On social media, the hashtag #StaySeated remained a rallying cry not just about airplanes, but about everyday acts of resistance. For David, the whirlwind didn't end with the call. Invitations poured in news interviews, keynote requests, think tank panels. He declined most. He didn't want to be turned into a symbol for profit or spectacle. What he did accept was one request to speak at a community center in Birmingham, the city where his father had once marched. The auditorium was modest, filled with young people, parents, elders with faces lined by decades of struggle and resilience. David stood at the podium, his navy suit the same as on the flight, but his voice softer now. "I didn't set out to make a statement," he began. "I set out to take my seat. The one I paid for, the one I belonged in. But sometimes the smallest acts, a refusal to move, a decision to stay put, become larger than we expect." He paused, scanning the faces. "When I was a boy, my father told me dignity isn't given, it's carried. On Flight 263, I carried it because I had no choice. But what I hope you hear tonight is this: you carry it too. Every one of you. And when you carry it, you show the world that respect is not optional." The room was silent, save for the steady breath of people leaning in. Then a young man in the back rose to his feet, clapping slowly. Others followed until the entire auditorium echoed with applause that seemed to shake the walls. David stepped back, humbled, letting the sound wash over him. He didn't smile widely. He simply nodded, a man who understood that applause wasn't for him alone, but for what the moment had come to mean. Later that night, back in his hotel, David sat by the window with a notebook again. He wrote about the flight, about the child's question, about Maria's kindness, about the look in Jessica's eyes when she realized her mistake. He wrote about silence as a weapon, stillness as a shield. When he set the pen down, he felt something rare, a sense of healing, not because the world had changed overnight, but because a door had opened across the city at a bar in Queens. Maria watched the same story on the evening news. Her name wasn't mentioned, but she didn't care. She knew she had chosen respect when it mattered, and that was enough. In a quiet apartment across town, Jessica stared at her empty uniform folded on the couch. She thought about the children she'd seen clutching their backpacks, about the man in 2A who never raised his voice. For the first time, she wondered what it would mean to start over not as a flight attendant, but as a human being who had something to learn. And in Boston, David's daughter Camille watched the clip of her father's community speech online. Tears blurred her vision, but her chest swelled with pride. She whispered to herself, "Stay seated. I will." Weeks later, the airline unveiled sweeping reforms, mandatory 40-hour bias training, independent audits, transparent reporting. For once, a corporation's promise was matched by action. Complaints began to drop, satisfaction to rise. Passengers noticed, employees noticed. Flight 263 became more than a number on a manifest. It became shorthand for a shift, a reminder etched into policy manuals and training videos. But for David, it was never about the headlines, the hashtags, or the applause. It was about something simpler, something truer, reclaiming space, refusing shame, and reminding the world that dignity has no seat assignment. As he looked out at the sky on another journey weeks later, sunlight pouring golden over the horizon, he allowed himself one quiet thought. Sometimes the most powerful change begins in silence, in a man staying put, in the world finally learning to listen. And with that, David Carter closed his eyes, steady in his seat, carrying dignity forward into the next horizon. The story of David Carter on Flight 263 teaches us something timeless. Dignity is not a luxury, and respect is not optional. In life, we will all face moments when we are asked, directly or indirectly, to shrink ourselves, to give up our rightful place, or to accept less than we deserve. The instinct may be to avoid conflict, to quietly comply. But sometimes, the most powerful act is to stay put. For older generations who have carried lifetimes of silent battles, this story is a reminder that the quiet strength you've shown has always mattered. For younger ones, it's a lesson that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it looks like calm stillness, a refusal to let injustice dictate the outcome. What we can carry into daily life is simple when confronted with disrespect. We have a choice. We can choose to surrender, or we can choose to stand, or sit, with grace and conviction. By doing so, we not only protect our own dignity, but also inspire those around us to believe that respect is a right, not a privilege. Thank you for watching and for sharing this journey with us. Stories like this remind us that respect and dignity belong to everyone. If this moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. So together, we can keep telling the stories that matter.